Throughout World War II, countless European cities fell under Nazi domination and were reshaped into places where everyday life lost its former sense of order. In each location, methods of survival differed depending on the regulations imposed, the local conditions, and the kind of occupation established. Some cities were razed from above, others devastated by starvation or the terror enforced by Nazi administration. Normal routines vanished. Access to food became unpredictable. Streets were patrolled by uninvited soldiers, and even the smallest actions, like speaking too loudly or meeting a stranger's eyes, could have dire consequences. Urban life adopted new rules, hierarchies, and fears. Each city provides a unique lens through which to view the mechanisms of control imposed by the Nazi regime on territories stripped from their inhabitants. What unfolded in these places exposes the deeply personal dimension of war, one not of battlefronts or tactics, but of the desperate struggle to remain alive under total occupation. Warsaw, a city divided in two. Warsaw ceased to resemble itself from the first days of German occupation. When German troops arrived in September 1939, it marked a definitive turning point. From then on, everything once familiar began to change. The Nazi authorities quickly enforced segregation policies, and although a closed ghetto did not yet exist, both physical and symbolic divisions between Jews and the rest of the population emerged immediately. Streets were split by visible barriers and invisible rules. Public trams followed different regulations, and daily life depended on the color of one's armband or the name printed on identity papers. The earliest days brought organized looting, arrests, public humiliation, and forced adaptation to a new reality. Shops were closed, seized, or handed over to German control. Employment vanished, wages stopped, and food grew scarce. Yet, Warsaw remained alive, though life now followed unfamiliar rhythms. The city was not fully walled in, but it already felt fragmented, zones of terror and zones of dominance. German forces occupied main avenues, taking over the finest buildings, transforming them into offices, barracks, and residences that replaced homes, schools, and local businesses. As months went by, segregation deepened. Jews lost access to most public transport and many areas of the city. Shops were labeled to specify who could enter. Families were forced to relocate to designated districts, triggering massive internal displacements. Once diverse neighborhoods emptied of some and overflowed with others. Homes became overcrowded. Those without a roof found shelter in streets or makeshift corners. By the end of 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was formally established. The city was split in two. The Aryan side, though still under occupation, maintained an illusion of altered normality. The walled-off Jewish quarter became a separate world, a parallel city. Brick and wooden barriers were erected, with entry and exit tightly controlled by German police. Movement without authorization meant death. Inside, life went on, but under drastically altered conditions. The streets were the same, yet their meaning had changed. Schools functioned sporadically. Hospitals worked with minimal means. Commerce survived as a desperate form of barter. Prices soared daily. Food supplies were limited and had to feed tens of thousands crammed together. Endless lines, hollow faces, and the homeless crowding the streets became daily sights. The ghetto, compressed into just a few square kilometers, held more than 300,000 people. The congestion was unbearable. Families shared single rooms, often with strangers. Beds were rotated in shifts. Hallways became kitchens, living spaces, or sleeping quarters. Courtyards once used for fresh air turned into sites for latrines, makeshift stoves, and improvised workshops. Privacy vanished, and time lost meaning. Days were measured by sirens. News spread through whispers and ration lines. Community groups attempted to preserve some structure. The Judenrat, the Jewish council imposed by German command, was tasked with the impossible, managing censuses, food distribution, internal rules, and coordination with the ghetto police. It held no true power, forced instead to execute external orders. Still, within the walls, people built fragile networks of support. Soup kitchens, orphanages, clinics, and even cultural gatherings appeared. Life adapted to confinement. Children scavenged streets, bartered or crossed through cracks in the wall via tunnels and cellars, some for food, some to deliver messages, many never to return. Smuggling became one of the few ways to survive. What entered through secret routes, flour, sugar, medicine, second-hand clothes, became as valuable as currency. Women and the elderly also took part, each in their own way. It wasn't crime, it was survival. Corpses on the streets became a grim routine. Disease spread quickly: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Doctors worked tirelessly, but lacked medicine and equipment. Pharmacies were empty or charged impossible prices. The official rations barely met a fraction of daily needs. Many survived only through underground aid networks or help from relatives beyond the walls. Temples still stood, though their roles shrank. Some rabbis continued their duties in silence. Others were driven away. Religious holidays persisted, celebrated with a single candle, a small loaf of bread, or a whispered prayer. Schools functioned in secret, in basements or tiny rooms with salvaged materials. Lessons were held quietly behind closed doors in case of raids. Even amid terror, children learned to read and write as police boots echoed outside. The ghetto was not merely a collection of isolated tragedies, it was a community enduring systematic collapse. Every family invented routines. Some embroidered at night, cooked with scraps, or made up games to comfort their children. Others copied books, wrote diaries, and documented memories. Windows, when not boarded, revealed a motionless world of walls and rooftops. Nights were filled with silence, or sudden gunshots, screams, or rumors at dawn. The wall not only split the city physically, but also mentally. Those inside could see the other Warsaw, where trams still ran, parks stayed open, and markets bustled with food. From high windows, some gazed toward that other world, the one they no longer belonged to. That vision deepened their imprisonment, but also kept hope alive. On the Aryan side, not everyone turned away. Some ignored the suffering. Others were afraid. A few tried to help. Secret aid groups risked their lives to deliver food, medicine, or messages, or to hide children from the Nazis' reach. But the help was limited compared to the volume of needs. Retaliation for collaborating with Jews was immediate. Arrest, torture, or execution. Fear kept many on the sidelines. Others saw the situation as an opportunity to enrich themselves or to inform on others in exchange for rewards. The Jewish police imposed within the ghetto generated internal tensions. Its members received different treatment from the Germans. And although they were also trapped within the besieged city, they enjoyed certain privileges: access to resources, the ability to move their families, or temporary protection. They were in charge of carrying out orders from outside. They had to regulate traffic, control documentation, organize lists, and hand over people. Their work wasn't voluntary, but that didn't eliminate the resentment they aroused. Some abused their positions, others tried to act with a certain degree of ethics, but all were viewed with distrust by the population. Time within the ghetto had a different measure. The calendar blurred. The seasons passed, but brought no visible change. The clothes remained the same. The streets didn't improve. Faces were quickly marked. What had once been a wait for the end of the war became a daily routine of surviving a few more hours. The sound of footsteps in the night indicated if there was a roundup, if someone was coming, if an execution was imminent. The walls listened and rumors spread as part of everyday life. Beginning in 1942, a new phase began. Mass deportations transformed the city once again. The Schlagplatz station north of the ghetto became the last stop for tens of thousands. From there, trains departed for Treblinka. The raids were daily. People were forcibly removed from their homes, selected on the streets, or detained for not having the correct papers. No one knew for sure what their fate would be, but rumors of extermination camps circulated by word of mouth. Some believed it was forced labor, others preferred not to imagine. During those months, the ghetto emptied at a brutal pace. Houses were left open, furniture abandoned, toys on the floor. Those who escaped the raids hid in attics, basements, between double walls or under floorboards. Children were stuffed into suitcases. The elderly slept in makeshift shelters. Some faked moving, feigned illness, or paid patrolmen for a few hours of silence. Even so, the numbers grew. In less than 3 months, more than 200,000 people were deported. What remained of the ghetto was a fraction of what had been there before. A smaller ghetto with fewer streets, fewer buildings, and less noise. Life went on, but it no longer had the same shape. Those who remained knew the end was a matter of time. Even so, they began to organize. Resistance groups were formed. Weapons were stockpiled. Manifestos were written. Cultural life, even in that context, did not die out. Readings, plays, history, and philosophy classes were held. Doctors continued to provide care. Teachers continued to teach. Women continued to cook. Children continued to play in what remained of the courtyards. Humanity did not stop, even though the environment was inhumane. In April 1943, the uprising began. A small group of young people with rudimentary weapons confronted the German army. The ghetto burned for weeks. Houses were burned one by one. Exits were sealed. Fighters resisted in tunnels, attics, and stairwells. The enclosed city became an urban battlefield. From the other side of the wall, the inhabitants of the rest of Warsaw saw the columns of smoke, heard the explosions, and some understood that it was the end of that parallel city. The repression was total. The ghetto was destroyed. The few buildings that remained standing were demolished. The dead combatants were buried in mass graves, and the survivors were relocated to camps. The city once again had changed its face. What remained was a landscape of ruins, loose bricks, and forgotten names. But amidst that devastation, the handwritten accounts, the drawings, the lists, the files buried in metal boxes or milk cans remained. They were left behind by those who knew they would disappear, but who wanted to leave a record of what they had experienced. Warsaw, in the end, was not just an occupied city, nor just a ruined capital. It was the setting for a parallel existence that defied the laws of hunger, confinement, and extermination. It was a space where routine mingled with resistance, where farewells were daily, but so were classes, stories, and everyday gestures. Every fragment of history, every hidden object, every secretly preserved paper shaped the memory of a city that was physically erased, but which was recorded by those who inhabited it until the very end. Occupied Paris on the morning of June 14, 1940, a German convoy entered Paris without resistance. The troops marched steadily along the main boulevards while most residents watched from their closed windows or stayed away from the streets. That entry was marked by neither fighting nor explosions. The Nazi flag was raised over the Eiffel Tower that same day, without any response from the city. The silence was not a sign of calm, but rather a sign that Paris, without a single shot being fired, had come under foreign control. The first German patrols were set up at strategic points such as the Place Concord and the headquarters of the Ministry of the Interior. The city, which only a few weeks earlier had been vibrating with uncertainty, was engulfed in a completely altered routine. In the days prior, more than half of Parisians had left the capital. It is estimated that nearly 2 million people, including civil servants, artists, doctors, train employees, and even police officers, left their homes to head south. The exodus left entire neighborhoods empty and hospitals understaffed. Trains to the provinces collapsed, and stations filled with suitcases, abandoned documents, and closure notices. The occupation found a shrunken city, with quieter than usual streets, empty offices, and cafes on hiatus. However, those who stayed out of necessity or conviction had to adapt to a new order from day one. The Germans immediately imposed regulations. Circulation was restricted to certain hours. Traffic signs were translated into German, and public buildings were placed under military control. Newspapers continued to be printed, but under the direct supervision of German officers. The radio controlled by the occupiers broadcast war reports and approved music. The shops that remained open offered goods in minimal quantities. Bread, sugar, and fuel began to be rationed. Street lighting was reduced, and the city began to darken as night fell. German officers were housed in the finest hotels such as the Meurice, the Ritz, and the Crillon, all located near the Louvre. Administrative commands and liaison officers were established there. Ordinary soldiers were housed in schools, sports clubs, and confiscated buildings. Some businesses, such as bakeries and tailor, were requisitioned for the exclusive use of the German army. Notices indicating that they would be occupied were posted in many homes, and owners were ordered to vacate without the right to protest. Despite the strict strictures of the new regime, there were no mass acts of violence at first. The German strategy was to maintain the appearance of normality. Barley coffee was still served in the cafes of the Latin Quarter, and movie theaters showed censored French films. Art exhibitions and concerts resumed within a few weeks, albeit under criteria imposed by the occupying authorities. On the busiest avenues, German soldiers walked among pedestrians without arousing visible suspicion. The armed presence was constant yet discreet in its form. However, the city's internal structures began to change. Artists, writers, and public figures faced immediate decisions. Some, like Jean Cocteau, continued to frequent thesalons and publications, adapting their discourse to what was tolerated. Others opted for silence or withdrawal. The German presence in cultural circles was evident. Magazines and newspapers such as Comedia and Le Figaro published articles that avoided any allusion to the war or the occupation, concentrating instead on theater, literature, and fashion. The German authorities encouraged this continuity to convey the image of a functioning capital even under foreign occupation. Daily life in the working-class neighborhoods showed a different side. Lines at bakeries grew longer, and the Vichy authorities began implementing the ration card system. Families received coupons indicating the exact amount of bread, meat, or milk they could purchase per week. Street markets operated with limited capacity, and products such as coffee, butter, and soap began to become scarce. Illegal sales on public streets and in discreet shops increased. The black market soon expanded. In the first months, arrests were sporadic and targeted at specific cases. People reported for offensive statements, suspected political activities, or citizens violating mobility regulations. The French police, subordinate but operational, maintained its own structure. As the weeks passed, checks intensified, and document searches began at stations and strategic intersections. Although racial laws were not immediately enforced, rumors were already circulating about searches and censuses targeting the Jewish community. The Jewish community of Paris, which numbered over 200,000 before the war, began to feel the effects of the occupation from the mid-1940s. Shops run by Jews were marked in internal registers and required to display signs indicating their origin. The yellow star was not yet imposed, but administrative pressure was growing. Some schools were instructed to limit the admission of Jewish children, and charitable organizations began to struggle to distribute aid. High-end cafes and restaurants continued to operate, albeit with reduced menus. The clientele in many cases included German officers, French collaborators, and figures from the publishing world. In some circles, a social routine developed that ignored the general situation. Nights in Marnanas and Matra did not disappear entirely, but their audiences changed. Live music continued in certain clubs, as long as it did not include prohibited songs or unapproved performers. The occupation authorities allowed a certain cultural leeway if this helped maintain public calm. Train stations operated with apparent normality but under absolute control. Photography was prohibited, and schedules were reduced. Many trains were reserved for military use. Postal correspondence continued, although it was read and censored. Public telephones were monitored, and private lines were tapped if any suspicion arose. Fear manifested itself in the way people spoke, in avoiding topics, and in reducing contacts. In homes, British radio began to be listened to secretly. Schools resumed activities in September under new guidelines. Some teachers were replaced, and the content was revised. The values of the French state were prioritized with an emphasis on order, duty, and family. History and literature classes omitted anything that might generate tension. Children grew up with rules that forced them to view what was happening as part of a new normal. Libraries closed for a time and reopened with revised collections. Bookstores withdrew titles by written order of the military administration. The city retained its structure, but its rhythms and forms were no longer the same. Despite the absence of bombings or mass destruction, Paris lived in a different time with a foreign presence permeating everything. The facades remained the same, but behind every window, every counter, every desk, the rules had changed. As the months passed, the city adopted a routine distorted by the occupation. Noises no longer caused the same alarm, and uniformed faces became part of the landscape. What at first seemed a temporary situation became a stable structure. The local administration operated within the limits imposed by the occupier, and the most important decisions were subject to German supervision. Outwardly, the capital continued to function, but under a progressive control that modified every aspect of urban life. Priorities shifted. It was not about moving forward, but about sustaining what remained. The artists and writers who remained in the city faced constant dilemmas. Some remained on the sidelines, not actively participating, but accepting the imposed conditions. Others chose to collaborate directly or indirectly with the regime's cultural institutions. Contracts, exhibition spaces, and guaranteed audiences were offered to those who agreed to align themselves with the official discourse. Some intellectuals seized these opportunities without reservation, signing manifestos, attending events organized by German authorities, or participating in supervised publications. Others did so out of convenience or fear, convinced that remaining visible was a form of protection. The public also adapted. Movie theaters continued to operate with carefully selected screenings. Bookstores offered permitted titles, and radio stations played official speeches alongside classical music or entertainment programs. Reading rooms, libraries, and cafes offered spaces for discussion, but with a moderate tone. The cultural environment did not disappear, but it operated within strict limits. Censorship not only eliminated content, but defined the entire framework of what was possible. In this environment, some readers learned to interpret between the lines, while others preferred to avoid any kind of interpretation. Measures against Jews became more visible. The obligation to wear Asteran clothing marked a clear change in the relationship with one's surroundings. Administrative restrictions were no longer enough. Now, every step was taken under forced exposure. Segregation became the norm, and those excluded from public life had to limit their movements or seek refuge. The French police implemented these policies effectively. They organized censuses, enforced regulations, and participated in mass arrests. Some citizens offered silent help, but most watched with resignation or indifference. Fear, conformity, or uncertainty blocked any collective attempt at opposition. Attempts to organize resistance began to gain traction, but were still in the minority. Clandestine networks, leaflet distribution, and contacts with the outside world existed, but they were carried out with extreme caution. Failures were paid for with arrest, deportation, or execution. The raids were selective but effective. Surveillance was continuous, and the authorities relied on local collaborators. At the same time, some members of the Parisian elite maintained social relationships with figures of the regime. Dinners, discreet receptions, and gatherings were held in confiscated properties. For those who occupied these spaces, the war seemed far away. There was heat, food, and security. On the other side of the city, entire families squeezed into poor rooms, hoping not to be discovered. The urban structure also changed. Some neighborhoods became militarized, and occupied buildings served as offices, residences, or interrogation centers. Train stations were checkpoints, and movement was subject to authorization. Commerce operated as permitted. Some products were obtained with coupons, others only on the black market. The official economy coexisted with an informal network that offered everything from food to forged papers. Corruption was not an exception, but another way to survive. There were those who benefited from the system and others who used it as their only available resource. In this scenario, collective morale fragmented. The city no longer shared a common vision. There were areas that sought to avoid attention, others that tried to collaborate without appearing submissive, and some that hoped for change without knowing how to bring it about. Rumors circulated quickly, but reliable information was scarce. There was talk of fronts, of advances and defeats, but almost all of it was speculation. Foreign radio stations were secretly listened to, and those who mentioned them in public took a risk. Even so, the perception grew that the conflict could change direction. This feeling fueled hope and at the same time distrust. The role of the local police became more evident over time. As repressive operations intensified, the active collaboration of French forces proved essential. From daily patrols to the execution of arrest warrants, officers participated directly in the regime's actions, identifying families, classifying them by origin, and coordinating transfers were tasks managed from local offices. This generated internal tension but did not spark confrontations. Institutional discipline prevailed over any kind of dissent. Toward the end of the occupation, the city showed visible signs of wear and tear. Although it had not been razed to the ground, its inhabitants lived in a state of exhaustion. The shortage of basic goods, the deteriorating infrastructure, and constant pressure affected all levels of society. The initial enthusiasm of some sectors had faded. Personal relationships were marked by suspicion, and the line between adaptation and complicity was increasingly difficult to draw. Meanwhile, clandestine movements increased. Acts of sabotage, document leaks, and contacts with other regions increased. The expectation of liberation was more concrete, but also more dangerous. In recent months, controls became more severe. Arrests were more frequent, and rumors of mass deportations circulated more strongly. Fear mingled with anticipation. Many awaited the return of Allied troops. Others feared internal reprisals once power changed hands. In some areas, walls were covered with torn-down posters, signs of clashes, or curfew notices. The city had not fallen into ruins, but its social and political structure was completely altered. It remained standing, but transformed by an occupation that had not required destruction to leave its mark. Rotterdam. On May 11, 1940, the population of Rotterdam awoke, still unaware of the magnitude of the previous day. The German bombing carried out while surrender negotiations were already underway had reduced the historic center to a landscape of ruins. More than 800 civilians died in minutes and tens of thousands were left homeless. The destruction was not driven by complex strategic reasons. It was a warning gesture, a way to force the country's surrender through fear. Unlike other European cities that attempted to preserve structures or monuments in Rotterdam, the logic of complete demolition prevailed. There was no room to rebuild on what remained. The Dutch authorities under German control from the following day promoted our development that took devastation as its starting point. The new urban design would not be a restoration of the past, but an organization of the present under control. With wide streets, functional blocks, and an absence of historical elements, Rotterdam's new center was modeled on the idea of efficiency. The priorities weren't symbolic. They were logistical, moving people, storing food supplies, moving quickly. Avenues were laid out without considering the previous fabric, and the city was divided into zones for administrative purposes. The collaboration of some Dutch technicians allowed this plan to advance uninterrupted. It wasn't just about repairing what had been destroyed, but also seizing the opportunity to erase the old city. In the eyes of the occupiers, a ruthless city was easier to manage. The loss of spatial identity facilitated population control. Those who lived in Rotterdam couldn't return to the streets they knew. They couldn't find their usual reference points. And in this void, obedience took hold. The population accepted the new order with a silence that wasn't necessarily complicit, but functional. The Calvinist moral system that governed much of social life in the Netherlands conditioned responses. The idea of virtue was associated with the fulfillment of duty, with emotional restraint, with obedience, not as resignation, but as discipline. This cultural framework did not require constant vigilance. In many families, the fear of exposing oneself or standing out in the community was more effective than any uniform. Repression was notable ways carried out by the German apparatus. In many cases, it was the social structure itself that imposed limits. The rules came from outside, but were obeyed from within. The trauma of the bombing also left a visible mark on everyday attitudes. People did not forget that an act of disobedience or delay on the part of the government had resulted in the total destruction of a city. From then on, many individual decisions were made with that precedent in mind. It was thought that any resistance, although morally valid, could bring disproportionate consequences. This logic of survival was internalized. Lines for rations were formed in an orderly manner. Restrictions on movement were accepted with docility. This was not a matter of trust in the occupiers, but a calculation of the real danger of disrupting the imposed routine. In the first months of occupation, direct and visible German intervention in civilian life was avoided. The Nazis understood that a traumatized city could be managed without undue pressure as long as the appearance of normality was maintained. Local structures were allowed to continue, functioning with external oversight. This strategy had a specific effect in Rotterdam. The feeling that there was no alternative. Obedience was a rational choice, not an explicit imposition. Soldiers weren't seen on every corner, but the margin for error was known to be minimal. Changes in urban life were not limited to architecture. Informal markets grew as the only response to planned scarcity. Official food supplies were insufficient, and a parallel exchange network developed that avoided public exposure. The trade of food, charcoal, and basic necessities became a silent, almost ritualistic activity. The city was organized into small alliances, family or neighborhood groups that operated by their own rules. Social relations ceased to depend on institutions and became based on minimal trust. In this context, denunciation was a constant risk. Repression did not need to be massive. Isolated cases were enough to mark the boundaries. A few public arrests, expulsions, or specific executions reinforced the idea that disobedience was not advisable. These were not numbers, but symbols. In an environment where everyone shared fear, the story of a family devastated for hiding someone was enough to deter others. Obedience functioned as a form of self-protection, not because people believed in the system, but because they feared personal collapse. Local religious leaders maintained an ambiguous role. They didn't promote active resistance, but neither did they align themselves with the regime. Their discourse reinforced the need to endure adversity with humility, without provoking, without destabilizing. This stance fit with the Calvinist tradition centered on individual sacrifice and patience. Many churches preached about suffering as a moral path, which reinforced acceptance of the existing order. The population found in these sermons a justification for their passivity. This wasn't a lack of awareness, but rather a moral rationalization for inaction. Transportation also reflected the new logic. Trams and bicycles replaced motor vehicles not out of an ecological choice, but due to the imposition of scarcity. The city moved silently, slowly. This forced pace impacted the perception of time. Days seemed longer, commutes more difficult, meetings shorter. Every daily activity was carried out with caution, as if any movement could be construed as suspicious. Even in the privacy of homes, people spoke in hushed voices. In this climate of subtle control, the city was rebuilt without enthusiasm. Shops were opened, services were restored, streets were cleaned, but there was no pride in this process. Normality was feigned, maintained out of convenience, not conviction. Rotterdam was not built as a symbol of resilience, but as an experimental site for functional reorganization, a city without a visible history, with imposed norms, and a population adapted to fear. In the midst of this altered environment, education took on a functional rather than formative role. Schools that survived the bombing reopened under supervision with modified curricula. Humanities content was reduced, and technical or practical subjects such as accounting, industrial drawing, and calculus were reinforced. National history was censored. Dutch literature replaced with neutral texts, and artistic expression was suppressed. Critical thinking and discussion were not encouraged. The classroom became a space of early obedience, where the important thing was to comply, not to excel. Many parents accepted this transformation out of fear of retaliation, but also because they believed that a disciplined child had a better chance of surviving in a predictable world. Public libraries were controlled along ideological lines. Titles deemed contrary to German order were withdrawn, and only publications approved by the censors were allowed. Reading became a private activity, disconnected from collective exchange. In some homes, forbidden books were kept with extreme care, protected as silent relics. These personal libraries were not acts of active resistance, but attempts to preserve a past that no longer had a public place. The use of urban space was also regulated. Downtown parks, redesigned after the destruction, no longer served a recreational role. They were empty, guarded spaces with benches devoid of people. Spontaneous socializing was discouraged. Squares ceased to be meeting points and became transit areas. The authorities imposed schedules, routes, and limits on all movement. Leisure activities disappeared as a visible category. Traditional celebrations were cancelled or absorbed into the propaganda apparatus. Popular rituals and local festivities were not permitted to continue. Everyday life was emptied of symbols, and the city became entirely utilitarian. Theaters remained closed for the first few years. When some reopened, they did so with repertoires selected by the occupants. Foreign works were translated, adapted, and stripped of any political charge. The intention was not to entertain, but to shape behavior. Attending a performance implied accepting controlled conditions, restricted hours, and limited audiences. Many citizens chose not to attend, more out of caution than conviction. Art ceased to be a space for expression. It became a contained activity, tolerated only as long as it did not pose a risk to public order. In this environment, domestic life took on central importance. The home became the only space where it was still possible to decide, even in minimal ways. Decoration, time management, the way meals were prepared or objects from the past were stored functioned as discrete forms of autonomy. This was not about rebellion, but about preserving some form of identity. However, even this private space was vulnerable. Raids, inspections, and requisitions could occur at any moment. People lived with the awareness that everything was provisional. The work system was reorganized with implacable logic. The factories that were still functioning came under German administration. Employees had to work longer shifts with lower wages and little protection. Production was geared towards supplying the regime, and any form of inefficiency was penalized. Unions were suppressed. Labor rights were eliminated, and mandatory quotas were established. Absenteeism was considered sabotage. Although some workers managed to negotiate minimum conditions, most accepted the new rules out of sheer necessity. Unemployment was not a viable option. Losing their job meant losing access to rations, housing, or legal documents. In the peripheral neighborhoods where control was less visible, mutual support networks emerged that operated in secret. Some families shared food, others hid wanted people, and still others simply exchanged information about impending raids or inspections. These networks did not respond to a common ideology, but to the need for protection among acquaintances. They were practical, fragile, and shifting alliances where trust was measured in concrete actions. Informers were a constant threat, and anonymous complaint was enough to dismantle any attempt at collaboration. Surveillance was not carried out solely from above. Many citizens acted as the eyes of the regime, motivated by fear, opportunism, or conviction. Some informed on their neighbors to gain privileges. Others did so to avoid suspicion. This dynamic broke traditional ties. Communities fragmented into closed circles. Conversations became brief, visits rare and courtesy superficial. No one knew for sure who might be listening or with what consequences. Young people grew up in this environment under a double pressure: the morality of the home and external discipline. They were required to show unquestioning obedience, but also enthusiasm for the new order. Some were recruited into youth organizations linked to the regime, where they learned to march, obey orders, and repeat slogans. The training focused not on skills, but on loyalty. Families accepted this participation out of fear of reprisals or because they believed they were protecting their children. Childhood was lived with forced maturity, where spontaneity was replaced by early surveillance. Language was also a tool of control. The public use of Dutch was restricted in certain official spaces, and German was promoted as the dominant language. Although this imposition was not fully enforced, it generated a subtle change in daily life. Posters, notices, and administrative forms began to be written in German. Many merchants adopted Germanized names for their businesses to avoid trouble. In schools, mandatory greetings and slogans were dictated in the language of the occupier. Linguistic adaptation was another form of invisible obedience. The press functioned as a propaganda channel with no room for dissent. Local newspapers were closed or absorbed by controlled agencies. News reports omitted abuses, glorified the regime's actions, and presented the situation as stable. A narrative was constructed in which the city progressed thanks to the imposed order. The lack of alternative media consolidated this narrative. In the absence of visible evidence to the contrary, many accepted this version out of inertia. Access to foreign radio stations was penalized. Listening to a banned station could lead to arrest. Thus, information ceased to be a right. It became a dangerous privilege. Over the years, the city modified by the occupation became an everyday landscape. The new avenues, the functional blocks, the lack of visible history, the internal rules of silence and caution were part of everyday life. There was no enthusiasm or pride, only permanence. Surviving meant adapting, not transforming. Obedience, restraint, and routine were useful tools in a context without clear alternatives. Thus, Rotterdam was not a symbol of open resistance or active collaboration. It was a space shaped by fear, by forced reorganization, and by the practical logic of those who understood that under certain conditions, compliance might be the only way to continue existing. Prague, the machinery of fear. During the German occupation, Prague was not simply a city under foreign control, but a space meticulously shaped by an administration that turned fear into a tool of government. From the first months, the German repressive apparatus operated with surgical precision, transforming urban routine into an environment where all behavior was observed, recorded, and, if necessary, punished. It was not just about controlling the population, but about shaping their behavior through constant fear. The rise of Reinhard Heydrich as Reich, protector of Bohemia and Moravia, marked a turning point. Upon his arrival in September 1941, the regime shifted from an authoritarian administration to a model of systematic occupation focused on eliminating all resistance, even potential resistance. His first action was to declare a state of emergency and enact a series of regulations suspending fundamental rights. Preventive arrests multiplied and previously postponed death sentences were reactivated. The Gestapo had clear instructions: neutralize any form of dissent, from organized sabotage to subversive comments made in hushed tones. The control structure extended from the headquarters at Prague Castle to the most remote alleys. The network of informants expanded considerably, with citizens encouraged to report any suspicious behavior. In factories, schools, and residential buildings, it was common for a worker, neighbor, or even a relative to be identified as a collaborator. Letters were opened, calls monitored, and visits recorded. The message was clear. Any word could be turned into evidence, any misinterpreted gesture into proof of guilt. The number of executions grew alarmingly. Unlike the early years of occupation, when prison sentences or forced labor were imposed, under Heydrich, the death sentence became the preferred solution. There was no need to prove guilt beyond a well-founded suspicion. In 1 week of his mandate, more than 180 people were executed publicly or secretly. Families were not notified and bodies were not returned. Disappearance without a trace became part of the punishment. The goal was not only to eliminate the individual, but to leave a void that destabilized their environment. Surveillance also extended to institutional life. Universities, once centers of thought and debate, were transformed into silent and fearful spaces. Student activities were indefinitely suspended. Professors had to submit their lectures for prior review, avoiding any historical, political, or literary references that might be considered ambiguous. Some departments were closed entirely, and campuses remained under regular patrol. What had once been a cultural bastion now served as a reminder of what had been lost. Heydrich didn't need to deploy an army to command obedience. It was enough that the rules were unpredictable and the consequences brutal. The regime avoided enforcing fixed rules. It preferred to maintain a margin of ambiguity that paralyzed the population. No one knew for sure what was permitted and what was not. This margin of uncertainty generated a permanent state of alert, where the safest course of action was to remain silent, to speak out, to trust. The city became a space where silence was preferred to risk and passivity to questioning. Propaganda campaigns reinforced this atmosphere. Posters with threatening messages were placed in tram stations, markets, and building entrances, warning that collaboration with the enemies of the Reich would be punished without exception. Newscasts projected images of summary executions, accompanied by voices narrating the crimes committed by those who, according to the official version, attempted to destabilize the peace. Even local newspapers were required to publish lists of those convicted with their full names and generic accusations to demonstrate that no citizen was beyond the authorities' radar. Prague Castle, the symbolic center of power, served as the coordinating hub of the control system. From there, orders were issued, reports received, and the fate of hundreds of people was decided each week. Heydrich held frequent meetings with police chiefs, army officers, and civil administration officials. The goal was not just to repress, but to design a functional, seamless occupation that did not require massive troops on the streets. His method consisted of governing through anticipation of punishment so that each inhabitant internalized the limits before transgressing them. Fear also seeped into the most everyday aspects. Shops were required to close at specific times. Family gatherings could not exceed a certain number of attendees, and the possession of certain foods or tools was grounds for interrogation. Surveillance even extended to religious celebrations where priests were instructed to omit references that could be interpreted as veiled opposition. Any deviation from protocol was sufficient to justify intervention. Daily life became an exercise in permanent self-censorship. In working-class neighborhoods, where the level of prior organization was highest, special police units were deployed, entries and exits were controlled, and work permits were frequently checked. In some areas, markets were replaced by centralized distribution points under German supervision. The objective was twofold: to limit unauthorized exchange and to facilitate the identification of potential subversive contacts. Every transaction was observed, every delivery noted, every absence reported. Communities ceased to be support networks and became minefields of suspicion. In a few months, Heydrich achieved what brute force alone had failed to do: paralyze an entire population without open confrontation. Prague, while remaining a living city, became a still city. Traumas continued to run. Children attended classes. Workers kept to their shifts. But everything occurred within a framework of collective resignation, where obedience was not a choice, but a condition of survival. During Heydrich's reign, Prague became a laboratory of total control. The Czech administration continued to operate, but was stripped of real power. Relevant decisions were overseen directly from the castle. Administrative obedience was not symbolic, but obligatory. The local police were integrated into the Reich surveillance systems with precise instructions to report suspicious movements and carry out repression tasks without question. Neighborhoods were divided into sectors with assigned officials. Every incident, visit, purchase, or absence was recorded. Schools, churches, and hospitals fed a constant stream of data. The system didn't require mass punishments. Targeted disappearances were enough to induce fear. Many were taken to distant facilities without a trace. The silence surrounding these absences reinforced self-censorship. Public executions were rare but carefully reported. The local press portrayed them as technical measures. Radio emphasized the stability they generated. At the same time, factories implemented direct surveillance with checks on belongings, conversations, and constant supervision. Any malfunction could be suspected of sabotage. Bureaucratic language was dehumanizing. It wasn't about people, but about unstable or untrustworthy individuals. Arrests didn't require proof. A delay, an imprecise response, or an unjustified letter was enough. The population quickly understood. Interactions were reduced. Doors were closed. Greetings disappeared. Isolation was the only defense. Tram ran, but passengers were silent. Agents could board at any time. Incorrect answers meant arrest. Nighttime visits required special permits. Religious celebrations were regulated. Family gatherings were restricted. Fear replaced customs. Heydrich was invisible but omnipresent. His face appeared in stations and offices. No one spoke his name aloud. When he was attacked, the city stood still. Neighborhoods were sealed off, suspects executed without trial, and literature was destroyed in retaliation. It sent a clear message. Any association with the act would be punished without distinction. The effect was immediate. Surveillance was redoubled. Churches were monitored. Cemeteries filled. Tedemand was not just obedience, but the dissolution of all personal boundaries. Control was not merely external. It had been internalized. The entire city operated as a network of crisscrossing surveillance. Prague under Heydrich was not just an occupied territory. It was a functioning system where every gesture, word, and omission could be interpreted as a threat. Life went on, but under a single rule. Life went on, but under a single rule. Do not stand out. Do not speak. Do not trust. Mass starvation in Greece. In the fall of 1941, while the rest of Europe had already been drawn into the center of the conflict, Greece faced a unique and devastating fate. With German armies established in Athens and strategic points across the country, basic living conditions began to deteriorate drastically. German soldiers not only took control of the territory, but also of food, infrastructure, and livelihoods. National reserves of wheat and other products were confiscated to supply the Axis troops, and what little remained was given to those collaborating with the new order. Cities, especially Athens and Pius, began to feel the consequences within weeks. The railway system was completely paralyzed, preventing the transport of food supplies from agricultural areas to urban regions. The naval blockade imposed by the British further aggravated the situation. In a mountainous country with fragile communication networks and scarce roads, the interruption of transport was equivalent to a deadly siege. Shops closed because they no longer had any merchandise, and markets lost their usual function. Instead of offering goods, they became spaces for gossip, desperate bartering, and surveillance. Inflation reached absurd levels, and money lost its value almost immediately. Instead, concrete goods began to circulate as units of exchange. A bar of soap could be worth more than whole banknotes. The first winter under occupation revealed the magnitude of the catastrophe. Deaths from starvation numbered in the thousands. Bodies of men and women lay on the sidewalks of Athens, covered with blankets or cardboard. Some were removed by relatives, but others remained exposed for days, waiting for an authority to remove them. Morgues were overwhelmed, and many bodies were buried without identification. Poor neighborhoods were the first to be decimated. In some areas, the average death toll reached more than 30 per day. Hospitals lacking supplies and insufficient staff were transformed into places of agony. Doctors tried to alleviate the suffering with what little they could find. But in many cases, there wasn't even clean water. The consumption of spoiled food, toxic roots, or fermented garbage began to cause concomitant illnesses such as dysentery and typhus. Children were the most vulnerable. Tens of thousands died in their mother's arms or alone without assistance. Severe malnutrition turned them into immobile. Figures with sunken eyes and gray faces recognizable by their appearance rather than their names. The initial reaction of the inhabitants was to establish an informal relief network, but it was swiftly dismantled. Churches, a few neighborhood groups, and certain physicians tried to coordinate the distribution of soup or bread. Yet the occupiers regarded these efforts as threats to their absolute authority. Any collective activity without prior consent was deemed suspicious. The soup kitchens soon came under surveillance, and those involved in their management were interrogated, detained, or, in extreme cases, executed. At the same time, the black market arose as the sole avenue for survival. People with access to storage depots, corrupt officers, or underground traders began to exploit the limited supply of food in exchange for jewelry, property, or favors. A single kilo of rice or sugar was sold at outrageous prices. Barter came to dominate all interactions. The black market extended into every district, forming a parallel, ever-present system tolerated by the Germans when it benefited them and crushed when it slipped beyond their reach. The figure of the metis, the go-between, linking peasants and city consumers, briefly gained influence but also became an object of public resentment. They were accused of profiting while others perished. Desperation reached such extremes that some looted these intermediaries or denounced them to the occupiers simply to seize their role. Human relations became utterly distorted. Communal bonds dissolved, and individual survival dictated every choice. Amid this despair, local leaders or community members who resisted plundering and sought to organize relief or solidarity efforts began to vanish. The Gestapo and collaborationist authorities showed no hesitation in silencing any dissenting voice. Public executions were infrequent but symbolic. Word spread quickly whenever a doctor, priest, or teacher was shot for organizing a network of aid. At other times, they were taken away and never seen again. Fear turned into an instrument of rule. Everyone understood that even attempting to help could mean death. Everyday life was reshaped by this logic of terror and deprivation. Searching for food could end in a beating, robbery, or arrest. Men waited for hours outside closed bakeries, hoping for an unexpected ration. Women roamed the city in search of edible remnants. Children became makeshift scavengers, rummaging through garbage heaps or ruins, risking their lives for a few scraps. Within months, Greece's social fabric was torn apart. The occupation not only stripped away political sovereignty, but also destroyed all support systems, economic stability, and human dignity. Starvation turned into a structural condition, deliberately sustained by the administrative decisions of the occupying forces. No one knew whether they would survive another day. Hunger was not an unintended result of the war. In Greece, it became a deliberate weapon of domination. By the spring of 1942, Greece's situation had reached one of its darkest moments. Shortages extended beyond food. The absence of coal, clothing, medicine, and fuel rendered city life nearly impossible. Public transport collapsed, forcing people to walk long distances on empty stomachs. Looting of vacant warehouses multiplied. Even when stores stood bare, Desperate crowds smashed windows searching for anything to eat or trade. The collaborationist police, armed and directed by the Germans, patrolled the streets with orders to suppress unrest, often firing without warning. In Athens' poorest quarters, control grew harsher. International relief, restricted by the British blockade, arrived slowly and unevenly. A few Swiss and Scandinavian organizations tried to establish food distribution networks, but access was tightly regulated by German officials. Supplies were frequently diverted to authorities or sold by intermediaries before reaching the starving. Promises of assistance created more despair than hope. Meanwhile, the sight of lifeless bodies on the streets ceased to shock. It became part of the city's landscape. The population, physically weakened and morally crushed, scarcely reacted. Entire families vanished, and some parents abandoned their children to institutions, praying they might have a better chance at life. The famine of 1941-1942 not only claimed over 100,000 lives, but also reshaped Greek society's understanding of power, community, and faith. It was a man-made disaster upheld by an administration that wielded hunger as a weapon of punishment, domination, and paralysis. The silence surrounding those months proved as deadly as the hunger itself.